There are moments when a public story does not explode all at once, but instead begins with a quiet shift that is easy to miss. Nothing dramatic happens at first. No announcement, no sudden statement, just small details that seem slightly out of place when viewed together. A canceled appearance, a delayed response, a silence where there is usually careful messaging. At first, most people move past it. Public figures disappear from headlines all the time. Brands adjust schedules. Media cycles move on, but then the pauses begin to stack up. One delay becomes several. A routine relationship becomes noticeably distant, and questions start forming, not because anyone has said something openly, but because no one has said anything at all. This is often how complex stories begin, not with proof, not with confirmation, but with absence. The absence of familiar patterns, the absence of reassurance, the absence of clarity. And when those absences stretch on long enough, they invite speculation, analysis, and quiet concern. Over the past several months, observers in media and public commentary circles have pointed out changes surrounding a well-known public figure whose image has long been carefully managed. Appearances once expected did not happen. Partnerships that once seemed secure appeared to cool without explanation. Conversations that were once off the record became noticeably cautious. None of this on its own proves anything. Public lives are complicated, business relationships change, personal priorities shift. But taken together, these moments form a pattern that has kept many people watching more closely than before, not because of scandal, but because of uncertainty. What makes this situation unusual is not a single claim or allegation. It is the growing sense that something unresolved is unfolding behind closed doors, something that involves reputation, influence, and the quiet rules that govern powerful industries, rules that are rarely written down, but are strictly enforced when crossed. This story is not about confirmed wrongdoing. It is not about verdicts or official findings. It is about a developing discussion that continues to surface across commentary spaces, raising questions about how public images are maintained, how privilege operates when attention fades, and what happens when long-standing assumptions are quietly challenged. And as more pieces slowly come into view, the question many are now asking is not what happened, but why the story refuses to go away. To understand why this discussion has gained momentum, it helps to step back and look at the broader context in which it developed. The public figure at the center of this story did not rise in isolation. Their reputation was built over time, shaped by visibility, access, and a carefully structured narrative that blended personal ambition with institutional prestige. For several years, this individual occupied a unique space between celebrity culture and formal influence. They were not only known for who they were, but for what they represented. Their presence carried symbolic value. When they appeared at events, wore certain designs, or aligned with specific organizations, those choices were read as signals. The public, the media, and even industry insiders learned to interpret these signals as intentional and meaningful. This position came with advantages. Doors opened more easily. Invitations arrived without being requested. Assumptions were made in their favor. In many industries, especially those built on image and association, perception often moves faster than verification. Trust is extended early, sometimes before boundaries are clearly defined. At the same time, the individual's public image depended heavily on consistency. The idea that they were dependable, professional, and mutually beneficial to partners was essential. Brands, institutions, and collaborators rely on predictability, even in high-profile relationships. When that predictability begins to slip, even slightly, attention follows. Early on, there were signs of strain that did not attract much notice. A partnership that quietly ended without explanation, a public appearance that felt less coordinated than expected, a press release that lacked its usual clarity. None of these moments triggered alarm. They were easy to dismiss as routine changes. But behind the scenes, industries that rely on discretion tend to notice small disruptions quickly. In fashion, entertainment, and media, relationships are often informal but closely monitored. Access is a form of currency, so is trust. Once questions arise internally, they are rarely voiced publicly right away. Instead, conversations happen quietly between advisors, managers, and legal teams. According to public commentary, this is when observers began noticing a subtle recalibration. Fewer high-profile placements, less visible support from legacy institutions, a shift in tone from enthusiastic endorsement to careful diss. These changes were not announced, they were felt. It is important to note that no official explanation has been offered for these shifts. No public accusations have been made. No formal statements have outlined disputes or disagreements. The lack of confirmation is part of what has fueled discussion. In the absence of clarity, people look for patterns. Another layer of context involves the changing landscape of influence itself. In recent years, public figures have increasingly been expected to function as brands. Their image is not only personal but commercial. Every appearance, collaboration, and endorsement is part of a broader ecosystem of value exchange. In this system, expectations are often unspoken but understood. When a public figure receives access, exposure, or support, there is an assumption of mutual respect for the boundaries of that relationship. When those boundaries are perceived to be tested, even unintentionally, trust can erode quickly. Public discussions have suggested that some partners may have felt uncertainty about where those boundaries stood, not because of a single incident, but because of cumulative friction. Small misunderstandings repeated over time can take on greater meaning, especially in environments where reputation is carefully protected. It is also worth considering the pressure placed on individuals who straddle different worlds. Balancing personal branding with institutional expectations is difficult. The rules of celebrity culture do not always align with the rules of legacy systems. What is acceptable in one space may be viewed as improper in another. As these tensions grew, so did the scrutiny. Commentators began revisiting earlier moments, re-examining past assumptions. Decisions that once seemed harmless were reinterpreted through a more cautious lens. This does not mean those interpretations are correct, but it does explain why interest intensified. By the time wider audiences began paying attention, the groundwork had already been laid. Conversations were happening not because of a dramatic revelation, but because of accumulated uncertainty. The story did not break, it surfaced. This is where the situation began to change from a series of isolated observations into a sustained discussion. People were no longer asking about one canceled event or one altered partnership. They were asking whether the pattern itself meant something more. At this point, many people started asking questions that had less to do with specific events and more to do with how decisions were being made behind the scenes. The focus shifted from what was visible to what was not. Why certain relationships cooled without explanation. Why familiar forms of support seemed to quietly disappear. Why statements that once arrived quickly now took time or did not arrive at all. In public commentary spaces, these questions were often framed cautiously. Observers were careful to say that nothing had been confirmed. No official disputes had been announced, but the discussion continued because the gaps in information were becoming harder to ignore. When patterns repeat, even neutral observers begin to wonder whether those patterns are coincidental. One of the earliest questions centered on expectations. In high-profile partnerships, expectations are rarely written down, but they are deeply understood. There is an assumption that access will be respected, that visibility will be handled carefully, and that private arrangements will remain private. When expectations are mismatched, tension does not always appear immediately. It builds slowly. Some commentary suggested that the individual at the center of the story may have approached certain relationships through a more informal lens than their partners expected. In celebrity culture, flexibility and improvisation are often rewarded. In more traditional institutions, consistency and restraint are valued. When those approaches collide, misunderstandings can occur without anyone intending harm. Another question involved boundaries. Public figures often rely on teams to manage logistics, communication, and image. This creates distance between the individual and the institutions they work with. If boundaries are crossed, intentionally or not, responsibility can become unclear. Was a decision personal, or was it delegated? Was it strategic, or was it simply assumed to be acceptable? According to public discussion, some partners may have begun reassessing their level of comfort, not because of a single action, but because they could not be certain where lines were being drawn. In industries built on reputation, uncertainty itself can be a risk. When clarity disappears, distance often follows. There were also questions about sustainability. Maintaining a high-profile public image requires constant reinforcement. Appearances, collaborations, and visibility must align to keep momentum. If that momentum slows, it can create pressure to compensate elsewhere. Some commentators wondered whether that pressure may have influenced decision-making, though there is no confirmation of this. As these discussions grew, they remained largely analytical rather than accusatory. Many emphasized that public figures are under constant strain, and that missteps, if they occur, are often the result of complex pressures rather than intent. Still, analysis continued because the situation did not resolve itself. Another layer involved how quickly narratives can shift. Once confidence in a public image begins to waver, even slightly, past behavior is often re-examined. Actions that were once overlooked are reconsidered. Relationships that seem secure are viewed through a different lens. This does not mean those reassessments are fair, but they are common in moments of uncertainty. Some observers pointed out that the lack of direct response contributed to the speculation. Silence can be strategic, but it can also leave space for interpretation. Without clear communication, audiences fill gaps with their own conclusions, shaped by whatever information is available. What followed was not a sudden escalation, but a steady expansion of interest. More people joined the discussion. More angles were considered. The story began to feel less like a rumor and more like an unresolved situation unfolding in slow motion. This is often how public narratives change, not through a single revelation, but through prolonged ambiguity. And as the ambiguity continued, attention naturally turned toward whether these patterns might point to something structural rather than temporary. This is where the tension began to rise, not because new information suddenly appeared, but because existing patterns started repeating in ways that felt harder to dismiss. Observers noted that when similar situations arise once or twice, they are often treated as coincidence. When they occur again and again, they invite closer inspection. Public commentary began focusing on consistency. The same types of partnerships seemed to follow the same arc: early enthusiasm, visible alignment, then gradually less engagement, fewer public acknowledgements, a polite distance that was never explained. None of this was dramatic. In fact, it was the calmness of the shift that drew attention. There were no disputes played out in public, no statements correcting the record, just quiet disengagement. Some analysts pointed out that this pattern mirrored how institutions protect themselves when they are unsure. Rather than escalate or confront, they step back. They limit exposure. They reduce reliance. This approach avoids conflict while preserving flexibility if circumstances change. It is a risk management strategy, not an accusation. As this interpretation circulated, attention turned toward the internal mechanics of high-profile image management. Public figures often rely on layered teams, including advisors, agents, and external partners. Decisions pass through multiple hands. Messages are filtered. Intent can become diluted. When something goes wrong, it is not always clear where responsibility lies. Commentators suggested that this diffusion of responsibility can create blind spots. If everyone assumes someone else is handling details, small issues can grow unnoticed. What one side sees as routine may appear improper to another. These mismatches rarely announce themselves. They surface later, often indirectly. Another recurring topic involved leverage. Visibility is powerful, but it is also temporary. Institutions that grant access understand this. They weigh short-term exposure against long-term reputation. When the balance feels uncertain, caution increases. According to public discussion, some organizations may have begun reassessing whether the attention they received justified the unpredictability they perceived. Again, none of this has been officially confirmed. These are interpretations drawn from observable shifts and industry norms, but the repetition of these shifts made the discussion feel less speculative over time. The same questions kept returning, even as answers remained unavailable. There was also growing attention on timing. Several changes appeared to cluster within a similar period. This raised questions about whether an internal reassessment was happening across multiple sectors at once. When different organizations reach similar conclusions independently, it can signal shared concerns, even if those concerns are never stated publicly. Public reaction to this phase was measured but increasingly engaged. The tone of discussion shifted from curiosity to cautious evaluation. People were no longer asking whether something was happening. They were asking what it might mean if it was. Media coverage reflected this shift. Articles became more analytical. Language became more careful. Rather than highlighting achievements or appearances, coverage focused on absence and context. What was not happening became as relevant as what was. Some commentators warned against overinterpretation. They emphasized that public figures experience ebbs and flows. Not every quiet period signals trouble. They urged restraint and patience. These voices played an important role in keeping the discussion grounded. At the same time, others argued that ignoring patterns can be just as misleading as exaggerating them. They pointed out that influence does not disappear randomly. It changes shape in response to conditions. When conditions change, outcomes follow. As these perspectives collided, the story gained depth without gaining certainty. It became less about a single individual and more about how systems respond when expectations become unclear. It became a case study in how reputation operates when confirmation is absent. What followed only added to the complexity. As attention increased, so did sensitivity. Small actions were scrutinized more closely. Silence was interpreted in multiple ways. Each development, no matter how minor, was evaluated for meaning. This phase did not produce answers, it produced momentum, and once momentum builds around a public narrative, it tends to sustain itself until something interrupts it. Either clarity arrives or the questions deepen. In this case, clarity remained elusive, and that uncertainty is what carried the story forward into a wider public conversation, one that extended beyond individual decisions and into the role of media, institutions, and audience expectation itself. As the discussion expanded, public reaction began to take on a different shape. What had started as quiet observation moved into broader conversation, not because of new claims, but because more people became aware of the same unresolved details. When enough individuals notice the same gaps, those gaps become part of the story themselves. Media coverage during this period remained careful. Reports avoided direct conclusions and leaned heavily on phrasing that emphasized uncertainty. Words like reportedly, according to public commentary, and no official confirmation appeared frequently. This tone reflected both legal caution and a recognition that the situation was still developing. At the same time, institutions connected to the public figure appeared to adjust their behavior. Schedules changed, mentions became less prominent. In some cases, previously routine acknowledgments were quietly removed or delayed. These actions were subtle and could easily be explained as routine updates, but taken together, they added to the perception that something had shifted. Observers noted that institutions rarely react publicly unless forced to. When they do respond quietly, it is often a signal of internal review rather than external conflict. This distinction mattered to analysts who were trying to understand whether the situation involved disagreement or reassessment. The absence of formal statements suggested the latter. Public opinion during this phase remained divided. Some viewers expressed frustration, arguing that speculation without confirmation risked unfair conclusions. Others felt that silence from official sources justified continued discussion. Both perspectives existed side by side, shaping a conversation that was cautious but persistent. Social media played a role, though not in the dramatic way often seen in viral controversies. There were no explosive trends or mass campaigns. Instead, the conversation unfolded slowly, with longer posts, comment threads, and analytical videos. The tone was less emotional and more investigative, reflecting the older, more reflective audience engaging with the topic. Industry insiders, while largely anonymous, contributed indirectly by offering context rather than claims. Commentary focused on how similar situations had unfolded in the past, emphasizing process over personality. These contributions helped frame the story as part of a larger system rather than a singular conflict. Institutions connected to the story appeared to prioritize stability. By limiting public engagement, they reduced the risk of escalation. This approach also protected them from being drawn into speculation. In doing so, they reinforced the idea that whatever was happening was being handled internally. This period marked a turning point. The story was no longer just about observation. It was about interpretation. Media outlets, commentators, and audiences began asking why so many entities seemed to be acting cautiously at the same time. Even without confirmation, coordinated restraint can feel meaningful. Importantly, no authority stepped forward to settle the matter. No clarification arrived to close the discussion. Instead, the silence continued, allowing analysis to deepen rather than dissipate. This is why the story did not fade. In many cases, lack of information causes interest to decline. In this case, it sustained it. The absence of resolution became the central feature. As public and media attention stabilized into a steady, ongoing conversation, it became clear that this situation had moved beyond a temporary phase. It had become a reference point, cited whenever discussions turned to influence, access, and the quiet rules that govern high-profile relationships. And as long as those rules remained unspoken, the story continued to invite reflection rather than closure, setting the stage for the final question that now defines it. Why, after all this time, does it still feel unfinished? This is why the story continues, even without a single defining moment to anchor it. In many public situations, interest fades once explanations are offered or attention shifts elsewhere. Here, the opposite has happened. The lack of resolution has kept the discussion alive, not because people are searching for drama, but because they are trying to understand a process that usually remains hidden. At its core, this situation touches on how influence actually works once the spotlight softens. Public figures often assume that visibility alone secures long-term support, but influence is conditional. It depends on trust, predictability, and shared understanding. When any of those weaken, access changes, sometimes quietly, sometimes permanently. Commentators have pointed out that this case illustrates how quickly assumptions can unravel. For a long time, the individual involved was seen as a guaranteed presence. Invitations, placements, and collaborations seemed automatic. When those expectations stopped being met, it raised a larger question about how much of that access was based on status rather than sustained alignment. Another reason the story persists is that it exposes tension between two systems that operate by different rules. Celebrity culture rewards visibility, speed, and boldness. Legacy institutions reward discretion, consistency, and control. Moving between these systems requires careful calibration. When that balance shifts, even slightly, friction can occur without anyone intending harm. Public discussion has also focused on accountability. In traditional structures, accountability is often clear and hierarchical. In modern influence culture, it can be diffuse. Teams manage decisions. Advisors filter information. Responsibility becomes shared and sometimes blurred. When something goes wrong, determining where correction should occur is not straightforward. This ambiguity makes closure difficult. Without a clear point of accountability, there is no obvious resolution. No statement fully addresses every question. No single explanation satisfies all observers. As a result, the conversation continues, evolving rather than ending. There's also the matter of precedent. Situations like this are closely watched because they signal how institutions might respond in similar cases. Observers are not only interested in the individual story, but in what it suggests about future relationships between public figures and powerful organizations. If influence can be quietly recalibrated without explanation, it changes how others navigate those spaces. It encourages caution. It reshapes expectations. This makes the story relevant beyond its immediate context. Another factor is the audience itself. The people following this discussion tend to value depth over speed. They are less interested in quick conclusions and more interested in understanding long-term implications. For them, unanswered questions are not frustrating, they are informative. Media dynamics also play a role. In the absence of official updates, coverage becomes reflective rather than reactive. Each piece adds context rather than news. This kind of coverage does not burn out quickly. It sustains interest through gradual analysis. Importantly, the discussion has largely avoided definitive claims. This restraint has kept it credible. By acknowledging uncertainty, commentators have maintained space for multiple interpretations. This openness prevents the story from collapsing under its own weight. Some have suggested that the situation may eventually resolve quietly without public acknowledgement. That is often how institutional recalibrations end. Relationships shift, new patterns form, attention moves on. But even if that happens, the questions raised here will linger. They linger because they challenge comfortable narratives about privilege, access, and permanence. They remind audiences that influence is not static. It must be maintained, and maintenance requires alignment, not just visibility. As long as these broader questions remain relevant, the story retains meaning. It is no longer about what happened, but about what the situation reveals. And that is why, even in the absence of confirmation, the discussion continues. Not because people are waiting for a revelation, but because they are learning something about how power, reputation, and silence interact. This brings the story toward its final phase, not with answers, but with reflection, because sometimes the lasting impact of a public situation is not what is proven, but what is understood differently afterward. As the conversation settles into this quieter phase, the tone naturally shifts away from analysis and toward reflection. There is less urgency now, and more consideration. Not because the situation has been resolved, but because enough time has passed for people to step back and look at what this story represents rather than what it proves. What stands out most is how little certainty there still is. No official conclusions have been offered. No definitive explanations have closed the loop. And yet, the discussion feels complete in another way. It has already revealed how fragile public narratives can be once they rely too heavily on assumption. For years, the idea of permanence surrounded certain public roles. Status felt fixed. Access seemed guaranteed. This situation has quietly challenged that belief. It suggests that influence is not something that can be stored or inherited. It has to be renewed, often without anyone noticing it happening. There's also a lesson here about silence. Silence is often interpreted as strategy, but it can also be a mirror. When no explanation arrives, people project meaning onto what they observe. Sometimes that meaning is unfair. Sometimes it is insightful. Either way, silence rarely keeps a story contained. Another reflection involves the systems themselves. Institutions do not operate on emotion. They operate on risk. When uncertainty appears, even in small forms, they adjust. They do not announce those adjustments. They simply move differently. From the outside, that movement can feel confusing or unsettling, but from the inside, it is often routine. This is why the story never turned explosive. There was no collapse, no confrontation. Instead, there was recalibration. And recalibration is harder to explain because it leaves no single moment to point to. For audiences who followed this closely, the experience has been less about judgment and more about awareness. Awareness of how influence is negotiated. Awareness of how quickly conditions can change. Awareness that public life, no matter how polished, is always subject to unseen pressures. It is also a reminder of how narratives age. What once felt inevitable can become conditional. What once felt protected can become provisional. These shifts do not always reflect failure. Sometimes they reflect reality asserting itself. Importantly, none of this requires a villain or a verdict. Stories like this do not need winners or losers to matter. Their value lies in what they expose about the structures we rarely see. As attention gradually moves elsewhere, the story will likely fade from daily conversation, but its imprint will remain. It will be referenced quietly, indirectly, whenever similar situations arise. It will shape how expectations are set and how caution is exercised. In the end, this was never just a story about one person. It was about the space between visibility and trust, between status and sustainability, between what is shown and what is maintained. And perhaps that is why it felt unsettling without being loud, because it reminded us that the most meaningful changes often happen without announcement, and the most important lessons are learned not from certainty, but from careful observation over time.